to Future Nation Schools. Our mission is to produce young people who are confident about themselves and are passionate about what they do. We believe our students have what it takes to become our country's next leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs who value the fact that we are African and are ready for the 21st century. Future Nation Schools aims to lead the African education revolution through our relevant, futuristic, Africa-focused and technology-enabled approach to education. Our network of schools consists of 2 campuses, one in Lyndhurst, which is less than 7 minutes away from Sandton, and the other in Vleerhof, near Roodepoort. Starting from 18 months old, Future Nation Schools offers quality, affordable, African-centered education for preschool, primary, and high school. Our program consists of an enhanced National CAPS curriculum, which includes coding, robotics, and the use of technology in the classroom, and an IEB examination in grade 12. The secret to our success is our unique teaching methodology known as project-based learning that we use from preschool right through to grade 12. Students gain knowledge and skills by working on a long-term, real-world driving question to investigate and respond to their newfound knowledge authentically, engagingly, and enjoyably. Each project is framed by a meaningful problem that challenges students to find solutions. Students must engage in a rigorous, extended process of asking questions, finding information, and applying the information to inform their chosen solution. All projects are developed within a real-world context with real consequences and potential, sometimes even creating opportunities for entrepreneurial skills to be developed. Through project-based learning, students learn to think critically, solve problems, collaborate, and communicate to answer their driving question. And because this model requires students to do much more than simply remember information, studies have found that students using project-based learning understand content more deeply and retain what they learn longer. Because of this approach, we keep our classroom small. Every student is recognized as a unique individual with the ability, ambition, and desire to learn and grow beyond what she or he thought was possible. In addition to project-based learning, Africa stands at the heart of everything we do. Not only is it key for us to show our students that knowledge does not only come from the West, but we believe it's vital that young people recognize that they have a place, a really important place in the world, where they can solve problems that have global implications. But it's not only what goes on in the classroom that matters. Each of our campuses also offers a number of sporting and cultural activities that develop young people in terms of their communication, leadership, debating, and critical thinking skills that cultivates a culture of diversity, fun, respect, integrity, and passion.
The difference between ordinary and extraordinary is that little extra here at Future Nation Schools.
Just like the school's tagline, someday all schools will teach this way.
We can't wait to help shape your child's future.
Thanks very much for spending this evening with us. And it's a real pleasure to have so many people who've joined us on this very important topic that we're going to be discussing today. Because as we know, this is Africa Month, and it being Africa Month, as the video indicated earlier, at Future Nation Schools, we put Africa at the center of everything that we do. So it's not just during Africa Month that we discuss issues relating to the continent. It is something that we do every day as part of our learning and teaching. And today's discussion is particularly important because Indigenous language teaching or mother tongue education has become a very important part of making sure that we are decolonizing our curriculum, that we can enable our children to read with meaning, because as we know, it's always been said that our children can't read for meaning, but when you look at the root cause of why that is, you soon discover that unless we address the issue of Indigenous language teaching, because, as we know, language is a bedrock of culture, it's a bedrock of knowledge transmission, it's a bedrock of how we live. It is important that we address this issue. Africa today is still divided into English-speaking Africa, or Lusophone, or Portuguese-speaking Africa, or Francophone, or French-speaking Africa. And this colonial past continues to hold us back. Of course, in the continent, we have over 1,500 languages. In fact, if we add dialects, it's more than 2,000 languages that are spoken in the continent. However, there is a possibility. In fact, it's been shown that if we can just use, for instance, technology, artificial intelligence, large language models that are able to produce content, we can solve a lot of the problems that we have in the continent. And it is an issue that our own government, the Department of Basic Education particularly, has started to do something about, because there's a recognition that mother tongue education, especially in such subjects as mathematics or science, as well as others, is quite important, because all along we've actually, lived in an environment where our languages have no academic value, have no epistemic value, have no commercial value. And this has to change, because if we continue on the path that we've been on, it just means that we'll forever hold our children back and not enable them to reach potential. And to help us navigate this topic today, Dr. Chuma was also previously a primary mathematics specialist at the Schools Enrichment Center of the Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which is otherwise called as AIMS in South Africa. But more importantly, there's a huge amount of really important work which Dr. Lindiwe Chuma has done in mathematics and the language issue particularly. It's a book that I've used as part of my own research for my PhD project in mathematics inclusion and exclusion. And it's quite amazing when you look at this book and when you read the book, just what is possible, particularly when you're teaching mathematics, using indigenous languages as a resource, because it is important that we start to do this. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Lindiwe Chuma, and let's all, I know we can't clap, but we can clap virtually here on the platform to invite and welcome Dr. Chuma to give us a presentation. In terms of questions, can I please ask all the participants today to use the chat function? We will make sure that at the end of the presentation by Dr. Lindiwe Chuma that we then address your questions. So please feel free to use the chat function. We will use that at the end of the session to answer your question. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Chuma.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob, for a very warm welcome. Good evening to everyone. Thank you also for being here. We do understand that you do have very busy schedules. It's a Monday evening after all, but thank you very much for being here. I'm going to share my screen and just check that we can all see. Just checking, is my screen sharing?
Yes, it is sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allow me to share with you some insights really regarding language diversity for curriculum decolonization. And I'm mainly going to talk about just three things, not much. We'll start by looking at the context. We'll start by looking at what is curriculum decolonization. And then we're going to look at three main aspects of the curriculum, which are the policy, the language and teaching resource materials that we use in the classrooms, and a few examples of classroom practices. To allow us to navigate into this space, I think maybe we could start at looking at what is happening in other African countries. The first country that I think we may take a leaf from is Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, they are currently having discussions like we're having now about curriculum decolonization. However, it's interesting to note that this country was never colonized like the rest of the African countries. It's a country that did not go through the violence. Well, we know we're the only ones with apartheid, but they never went through all that. So it becomes interesting to find that they talk about curriculum decolonization when they were never colonized. We can also take a leaf from Kenya, which is a bit of an opposite from what we have in Ethiopia. In Kenya, they've just recently launched what they call the Harambee approach to decolonizing the education system. It means they've gone beyond realizing that they were once decolonized, and they've established what they call the Harambee schools, which accommodate learners who maybe do not afford the quality education that the other learners do afford. And they have created for themselves a specific framework that is going to pull through the indigenous languages and the other aspects of the curriculum that they can. Now, coming back home, regarding the use of indigenous languages, we've got what is called the mother tongue-based bilingual education, an approach which has been used in the Eastern Cape for about 12 years now. But I think what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the talk is it enough? We have done something, definitely. At least it doesn't look like we trying to take what Ethiopia has done, but we have done something. We've got a few projects taking place in the Eastern Cape. Let's look at what they've done so far, and then we'll answer some few questions at the end. Now, looking at the different stages of curriculum decolonization, we start with the rediscovery, the recovery stage, and it progresses up until the action stage. So in rediscovery, that's where we realize that actually we were colonized. Actually, we do want to recover from this history. Actually, we want to do something about it. That's when we start being reminded of the fact that we are not using as much of our language as we would like to, and our identity is somehow lost. Then in the next stage that follows is the mourning stage, where we actually are depressed or feel sad about the whole situation. Then we move on to the dreaming part, where we start thinking, what can we possibly do? We start imagining alternative ways. We start imagining alternative pathways that we can use. And that's where we start beginning to have thoughts about having a new curriculum, a revised curriculum, a curriculum that represents us, that it represents our identity. From there, we get people becoming committed now we know what we want. We are committing ourselves to doing 1, 2, 3. They may have different strategies they want to put in place, but the whole idea is that people commit themselves to want to include, or at least to want to increase the volume of those that were colonized before, or those that feel that they are not being represented in their curriculum. Then the last part, like we said, is the action, where actions start shaping up and people actually work on stuff that they want to do to see their curriculum being changed. And when we're looking at decolonization specifically, we've mentioned that it starts with acknowledging. Before we acknowledge that we're colonized, it becomes difficult for us to go through the different stages that we've spoken about. And before we identify what is wrong, it becomes difficult for us to take the next step. Then in education specifically, when we're talking about revising or reviewing what is in place, we start looking at the policies that govern us, the policies that stipulate what needs to be taught and how should it be taught, in the languages that should be used to teach whatever it is that's going to be taught. We start looking at other components of the curriculum, such as the assessment. We know when we teach, we're going to assess at the end, or we assess while we're teaching, but we want to see how the decolonization aspect can come through in the assessment, in the everyday practices, in the classroom, and also in the source materials. because it's important. Even when we go into our classrooms, we always need our textbooks, our workbooks, our teachings. What's also important is the fact that when you're speaking of indigenization or Africanization of the curriculum, we're talking about both the higher end basic education institutions, not just one of them. So it should span across the whole spectrum. Now, characteristics of a decolonized curriculum mean that language is at the heart of this debate. It means that we are internationalizing our indigenous experiences. Previous research has been, in a way, condemning what has been happening, condemning what has been, the practices that were there in the colonial era. But where we are right now, we're actually saying, hang on, there's a bit that we can learn from the West. How do we make sure our voices are not drowned by the West? How do we make sure our voices still come up and be heard, and we can reflect and we can see ourselves, we can use examples of what we are used to, and not just silencing the West? Because if we're to be honest with ourselves, though these ideologies came through when we were colonized, but there's something that we can learn from them. So it's about the internationalization of our own experiences and the bringing up of our languages into the science, the mathematics, whatever ideas that they've brought to us, but owning it instead of being drowned by them. And the language part of it, then, as I've mentioned before, it deals mainly with the use of indigenous languages. When we teach, like we're saying, we want to own these experiences, so we should use our own languages to teach the content. We need to appreciate the diversity of the indigenous languages. In the introduction, it was mentioned that we've got quite a number of languages. So if we include the dialects, more than 200. So their diversity comes through, because now we get to a point where we need to decide which of or the indigenous languages that we have are we going to be using. Now, coming closer to the use of our indigenous languages in multilingual settings, because once we've got more than one, if it's two, it's bilingual, if more, then it becomes multilingual. There are benefits of using multilingual practices in the classrooms, and what some of them highlighted here, it values our own education system. We allow our learners to become creative. You know, they start, even when they're working on projects, etc., they start infusing their own practices, their own experiences, and expressing them in the best way that they can. And then we also appreciate our local languages. And while I've even mentioned this, it's also part of developing these languages, so that we don't keep lamenting that they're not developed because we're not using them in academia. This is not exhaustive. There's quite a number of others, but this is just a snapshot into really why should we be using, or what's in it for us to be using our languages. Now, having looked at what is happening in the different countries, and also remember globally, we do have other countries that actually started looking at indigenization or decolonizing their own curriculum, we realize that there are some gaps in this discourse. There are some gaps because multilingualism has not been given the pedestal that it needs to have. Multilingual learners are often disadvantaged. They're not recognized. We pull them into the classroom and tell them to leave their additional languages by the door. When they get into my classroom, they should start speaking in English or French or whatever language that I'm using. And also we find that we've been mentioning that when I'm in the classroom, there are resources that I'm going to need. But then if those resources are not supporting the use of my indigenous language, or they're not supporting multilingualism, it becomes a problem. And all this leads to a system that is suppressing learners' home languages. It's systematic. The suppression is not just in one aspect, but it's from different directions. That is definitely a gap. To go on to further, we're going to look at the research that has been conducted in the past 2 decades or so, looking at reversing this whole situation and using language as a resource in different classrooms. I'm going to use quite a number of examples from mathematics classrooms. It's the space that I work in, but the key thing is let's look at what has been happening, what has been taking place. The discourse of language in the classroom in about 2000, Adler is a South African researcher who actually described language as a cultural resource. Language, if there are two people in a room and there's nothing else in an empty room, they at least have their language that they bring in. It's a resource that is available, and it is not constrained very much, because as long as a person can speak or as long as a person can write, they are able to use their language. We've also had discourse that talks about language as a right, as a problem, and as a resource as well. As a right, because it is part of our constitution. Everybody has a right to learn in the language that they prefer to. Then we've got the part where it is problematized, where we actually view our multilingual learners as less capable, which is not true as we've been looking at it. Actually, we need to be embracing the different languages they bring into the classroom. Then as a resource, because you can imagine, if I'm in a classroom with 10, 15 learners all speaking 10, 15 different languages, surely I've got 10, 15 different ways of explaining the same concept, be it mathematics or science or whatever. So therefore, it needs to be seen as a resource. And we, in cases where we are using maybe bilingual systems or even multilingual systems, sometimes we want to limit learners to just thinking, don't use your mother tongue in the classroom, but when you get into the classroom, I'll start introducing new words, new vocabulary. But is that all there is about learning a language? Not necessarily. There are other resources, the semiotic resources, including the gestures, the intonations learners make when they are expressing themselves. They all add to meaning making. And still speaking about meaning, you know, the various languages, the various discourses, voices in the classroom can all add to the creation of meaning, which is what all classrooms are meant for. It's about creating meaning, and therefore language should be seen as a resource. I'm going to talk a little bit further about the monoglossic and heteroglossic approaches, which is where we are regarding research in the use of indigenous languages. In monoglossic approaches, we're only thinking there's just one pure language which will be used. And that's what we're using before, thinking English is the only language that should be used in our context. But we need to start looking at heteroglossic approaches, making use of multiple languages for the benefit of the learners. Now, looking at policy, it's important that we look at policy because it stipulates what we're going to do. We are all governed by policy, be it if I'm office-based or I'm in a classroom, I'm governed by a specific policy. This is what is currently happening in the country. We now have 12 official languages, but our language and education policy stipulates that instruction at the foundation phase should be in all the official languages, not all the official languages. But what is happening in practice, we've got something different. In practice, the classrooms that we have fall under these two options that we currently have. We do have classrooms where there are different languages. Maybe we can have all 12 of them, but only one of those languages is used. We can't call that multilingualism. We actually call it multiple monolingualism. Out of all the different languages that are there in the classroom, we then choose just one. That's contrary to what the policy says. Policy says we need to use all of them, can be used equally. But when we get learners in the classroom, then we get them to use just one. So that practice of option A is against policy. Option B similarly is against policy because option B is talking about where we immerse learners into learning in English, or it could be any other language. And we view that language as the best one for learning or for teaching. And with the immersion, the learners are immersed into learning in English right from grade R, the foundation phase level. So you can see that both practices, none of them is adhering to the multilingual aspect of what the language and education policy stipulates. And let's move on to the learning and teaching support materials. Like I indicated before, when I go into a classroom, I would have my lesson plan, I have my teacher guide, I've got the learner workbooks, etc., the work that I display in the classroom. All those are different kinds of resources. Now we even have the technology aspect of it. Those are all the different kinds of resources that we'll use in a classroom. Now, it's the the people who design these resources for us need to be aware of the debate on curriculum decolonization. Because if they are not aware, they are going to continue producing learning and teaching source materials for us which do not promote the multilingual aspects we're looking for, which do not promote or which are against the decolonization of our curriculum. So it's been noted, this is from a research done by Porteous 2023, that sometimes us as teachers, the relationship that we have with the language of learning and teaching is not the best. And therefore, to leverage on this, or maybe to turn this around, there are opportunities for the design of our workbooks or the design of our teacher guides to actually normalize and develop an accurate and friendly instructional register for teaching mathematics in an African language. If the book that's guiding me is going to be written throughout in English, it's not going to give me any pointers where now you can start explaining this, or you can use learners' cultural or give examples that are taken from the learner's culture and the environment, then it leaves me as a teacher to guess when I'm going to do this. And we do know sometimes, we know that teachers are the foot soldiers of the system, but because they've got so much work to do, if we don't give them those pointers, if we don't give them the relevant, we are now expecting them to go and develop their own, which they may not be able to do. So it means the developers of our learning and teaching source materials need to be aware that we are in a process of decolonizing the curriculum, and therefore they should produce learning and teaching source materials which are relevant, which at least speak to our objectives. Sometimes we do not give the specific instructional narratives that we need to be modeling to the learners, and this also becomes a problem. And if it is not modeled in the book, or it is not modeled by those who develop the books for us, it is a problem. And there is debate which is talking about us theorizing a lot of what happens in subjects like mathematics and science and others, where there is a lot of abstract content, and we want to keep our learners silent and they don't talk. And without allowing them to talk, it becomes a problem. And to go a step further, when we allow them to talk, let's make sure that they are talking and they're expanding their vocabulary and they are discussing these ideas and expressing them in the languages that they understand best. So these are just a few of the ways that the people who develop our workbooks could actually tap into to support the dialogue that we're having. In a separate piece of research which was conducted, six different LTSMs were compared, and they ranged from, these were mathematics materials, and this focus was specifically on learner workbooks. I'll just give a reason why this research used learner workbooks. Is because in the classroom, this is one resource that is used widely. Sometimes we do have teacher guides, but we don't use them that often. Sometimes we do have the lesson plans, etc. But with the learner workbook, it's one of the most, or the widely used in almost every classroom. So we looked at 6 different learning and teaching source materials, specifically the learner workbook component. And the key point that I'm highlighting here is that we're looking at the coverage of language in those learner workbooks. So it just wasn't coverage of language, but the use of how the books were supporting multilingual teaching and learning approaches, or how they were either being by using at least 2 languages or using more than one. So this color coding here shows that the LTSMs or the components that are in red mean that they were not adhering to any support of multilingualism at all. If you can look at LTM number 6, it's strictly monolingual. It's in English, and even learner talk activities. Like we said, we need to get our learners to be talking and even to be encouraging them to be asking questions. So if all of it is done in English, in this particular research, we coded it as red, because then we are not supporting bilingualism. They are not supporting multilingualism. And as you can see, we spoke about instructional sentences just now. We spoke about giving learners opportunities to externalize, or at least to talk as much as they can. So as you can see, LTSM1 has, it's amber in some of the areas, but has some red, meaning it's not covering, or it's not promoting the multilingual approaches we're trying to. If you look at LTSM 4 and 5, you see it was ticking all the boxes. There was use of language which is suitable to the context. And in this case, LTSM 4 was using both English and isiXhosa. Remember what we said earlier, to say we are not throwing the West out of the window. We're using the good that we have learned from the West, but we are making sure that our indigenous languages are being heard. So if a learner workbook is using, because it will be incremental introduction of the English, but also using the isiXhosa that the learner is used to speaking every day, then we're promoting both, and we are making sure whatever is not understood in English, it is explained in the other language. And I'm not going to dwell much into the different details, but generally you can see that the majority of the books, and these books were actually at national level, books that are available nationally, the majority of them are not conforming to the multilingual discourse that we're having. This is an example of a grade 3 mathematics textbook, specifically from the Magic Classroom Collective, a very successful project which is being implemented in the Eastern Cape, where primary school mathematics books are being produced in isiXhosa. What I just wanted to highlight here is that you see at the bottom here, there is also an opportunity for learners to speak about, or at least to revert to, the use of English. In a classroom here, the teacher is able to use this material and get learners to understand. The first one is demonstrating addition. The other one is demonstrating subtraction, but we do actually have these resources that have been developed in our African languages. Now let's go to classroom practices. What kind of classroom practices support the bilingual approach, the multilingual approach that we are promoting? Earlier, we spoke about, when we're talking about how to what extent we've decolonized our curriculum, we spoke about the mother tongue-based bilingual education program. This has been taking place, like I indicated, since 2012 in the Eastern Cape, and these are the specific characteristics for this. Obviously, from point to point, we are going to have variations depending on how well the teacher understands or the other resources the teacher has available, but at least we do have guidelines on how the MTBBE is supposed to be used. One of the key issues is that it is the mother tongue which is supposed to be used with the first additional language, which in most cases will be the English. Complementarily, and at some point they should be used at 50-50. Like if I'm in a classroom, I should be half of the content the learners should be able to understand it in their own language. And also it's the dual use of the two languages. Remember, we said we don't want our indigenous languages to be silenced. So with dual use, there is no English language that is overpowering the other, and the first language is being introduced incrementally. And it all depends on the competence of the learners. That's when the teacher may decide they're going to introduce, but the key language that is being used in those classrooms is isiXhosa, and it is used as the language of learning and teaching. It is used as the formative language in those classrooms. And we've had some results coming from the MTBBE project in the Eastern Cape. Established in 2012, but as from 2014 already, we're seeing results. In a specific school like this one, which is given, learners improved from obtaining 40% in the first year of the project being introduced to a point where they scored 100%. We are aware that when we bring in the international assessments on education, even the local assessments, not in most cases, we are always faring lowest. We are always getting low marks. But if we can have a project which in 2 years can improve learner performance in mathematics from 40% to 100%, I think we can see that we are reaping some results there. By 2015, because of the the reach, or at least the results that the district was reaping from the different schools that were taking part. More than 81 schools were actually implementing this, and all the content for mathematics, natural science, and technology were being learned in isiXhosa. And the idea was that we get to learners to understand all this abstract information in the language that they know best. And by 2020, we've actually had the quintile 1 and 3 schools in specific districts of the Eastern Cape actually taking their NCS mathematics assessments in isiXhosa. At the time, it was isiXhosa and Sesotho, but the whole idea was that we cannot continue having our NCS mathematics exams in English. As you can see, this is an extract from an actual examination paper. This is the 2021 paper on data handling, where we have the specific, we had a whole question paper in an African language. We're getting, sometimes we say we can't get learners to explain what an equation is. Here it is. We have a scatter plot, you know, it's being explained to learners in the language they understand so that we can improve their performance. So this is an example of a project that we've had. I think it's actually one of the few projects that we've had in the country that has produced so many positive results. Here is a different project. This is specifically focusing in the foundation phase. It is the Math and Language Improvement Program. It was implemented in the Eastern Cape as a pilot. Currently, it is being implemented in Gauteng province, and using the results that were obtained from the Western Cape, then it is being piloted and slightly adjusted. But you can see a grade R learner being taught mathematics through storytelling, and storytelling in an Indigenous language. And when we ask the learners the kind of questions, just like you would have comprehension questions, they get to understand the mathematics, they get to understand how to count. We've got the number symbol, we've got the number name, etc., and the representations. It's all examples of how we can practically use indigenous languages in our classrooms. The only part about this example is that it's being implemented in the foundation phase, and the policy says we should be implementing this in the foundation phase anyway. We are yet to see how far this is going to go in the Gauteng province. But these are practical examples that can possibly be used. Where to from here? I don't know. We are not hoping to be getting answers by the end of this talk, but we can share some ideas. Definitely, we've seen that the multi-monolingual approach is not the right interpretation of the policy that we have. It's good that we've got books that are using bilingual and multilingual approaches. It's welcome. It means we've moved away from having each and every resource in the classroom being written in English. So it's good that we've made some progress, but have we made enough progress? We are still having a problem of having just one language being used, even with the books that we have in the ones that were in the red. If the book is just only in English throughout, then it becomes a problem for the learners. And we need to start looking at the fact that our classrooms are not the same. We've got classrooms in urban environments. We've got classrooms in basically rural environments. They are not the same. In predominantly rural environments, it's mainly bilingual approaches, because I'll be in a classroom and maybe the majority of the learners speak Sesotho, and there's a bit of English. Maybe the teacher also speaks Sesotho. So we need to be producing the resources, or we need to be at least having our policies speaking to what should be happening in a predominantly rural or predominantly bilingual classroom, where there is one major language spoken by the majority of the people, and then we're trying to introduce bits of, surely the material we use there, or the policies, the guidelines that should be given to the teacher in those kind of contexts would not be the same with those in an urban environment. If I'm to go into, I'll pick, let me say I go into a classroom in Hillbrow. or any other highly densely populated area, I'm going to find at least 7 or 8 different languages in there. How does the teacher harness all those to make sure that the learners can understand the abstract information that is being explained? I could find some languages which are even from outside the country, but we should not be seeing those as disadvantages. Instead, it's a resource. Even if we are still following the multiple monolingual approach where one language is dominating, at least get the learners to be speaking in their different languages before we pull it through to the language that currently is being stipulated by the policy to be the language that is being used. There's some research that was done by Svanda 2019 where he highlighted the use of what he calls urban location lingua. For our learners in the townships, that is their culture. We can't take that away from them. How do I bring it back into my mathematics classroom? How do I bring that into my technology classroom and get the learner to understand the concepts without throwing their culture away? Because once I take that away from them, I'm kind of like using a deficit approach. They are coming with less than what they could possibly use. So it's about harnessing the different languages that we have because they are there. They are naturally there. The idea is to bring them into the classroom and get the learners to use them for their benefit. We've spoken about localizing the context. We've spoken about using the examples that learners find in their environment. That is critical. We need to make information as easy as possible for the learners by using what they use every day outside the classroom. Then they are going to enjoy their learning. Reading for meaning, very important. It doesn't matter whether we're reading in an indigenous language or we're reading in English. We need to remove the reading difficulties. We need to help our learners to be able to read and understand, or else the curriculum decolonization project would be sabotaged. We need to use the heteroglossic approaches. We've been talking about them. The use of multiple language in the classroom, the use of the different languages and get them. One might be asking, how am I going to, as a teacher, how am I supposed to be speaking 12 different languages? It's not necessarily about that. Even if I speak just one language, but I should allow learners to be able to discuss ideas in their own languages. You may find 2-3 of them, they speak Sesotho. Another 2-3, they also speak Xhosa. Get them to speak about what they understand best in their language. This is from a teacher's diary. A teacher was explaining how they've been using code switching to assist a grade R learner, etc. And those are some of the practices that we need to be using in our classroom. Those are the communicative approaches. It's not just code switching. There's translanguaging, there's code meshing, there's plurilingualism, there's all sorts of them. It's about, and some of it's approaches that have been used previously. It's just that we didn't name them. We didn't put the fancy names to them. But it's approaches that, like in the Eastern Cape, if we were to go back to, predominantly, we've had very low passes in that province, to a point where in 2014, the Eastern Cape Department of Education was put under administration, and we've been problematizing the fact that the teachers will teach an English essay it's what has been happening. But then now we need to provide guidelines of how to code switch appropriately, provide guidelines of how to translanguage, provide guidelines on how to language cross. And this also speaks to our teacher education curricula. Initially, we did talk that if we are going to talk about curriculum decolonization, it has to start from the lecture rooms, or it has to start from the basic classrooms up until the lecture rooms. If we are using this in our classrooms, then the people who are responsible for preparing our teachers need to talk about or need to model the kind of approaches we need to see in a decolonized curriculum. So it's important that we allow our learners to use or to at least lean on the multilingualism that they bring into the classroom. We've spoken about LTSM development, and we've spoken about how curriculum developers can assist us in the design of the books we have in the classrooms. And persistently, we've had complaints about the quality of the translations. Sometimes we say we are adapting, because once we've got all these complaints, then it means we we are not seeing much value from the use of our indigenous languages. But then this is where we need to do the work. We need to bring in language experts. We need them to get to work with mathematics experts and the linguists so that they can improve on the quality of the materials that are produced, but they can improve on the dictionaries so that there is standardization and we get our learners to get the quality, because indigenization must not mean that we are compromising on quality. It must not mean that we are now producing inferior metric students, but then if we use it appropriately, the problem is sometimes we do not have enough information or the basics on how to use it appropriately, and then we end up with substandard results. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to end here and I'm going to leave you with a few questions. One of them being, we spoke about the different stages of curriculum decolonization. Where are we as a country regarding curriculum decolonization? We don't have to answer this at national level, but where are we? If there are any teachers amongst us, where are we within our classrooms regarding the different stages? Are we still mourning of the ills that were brought by the colonialists, brought by apartheid? Where are we? We could obviously say that at least in the Eastern Cape, I think from the MTBBE program, they've moved to the action because we have these results now that we are reaping, and the project has been implemented for the past 12 years. So at least the Eastern Cape has moved to the action stage. Where is the rest of the country? Is it enough for us to just have one province? We did talk about the Gauteng province, but like we said, it's just at foundation phase level. It's also important for us to I didn't want to use the word challenge, but it's important for us to challenge our policymakers. We can't continue with multiple monolingualism and at the same time be talking about decolonizing the curriculum. Something needs to change. Our policies need to be reviewed, and so that they are aligned to the discourse that we're having. And we also need to start challenging the quality of materials that are produced, so that we are not using that as an excuse not to move through to a decolonized curriculum. We cannot continue using that. Let's pull through the resources that are needed so that we end up with, we do not compromise and say, because a learner is being taught in Sibedi, then we expect an inferior kind of product. And our everyday classroom practices, how should they be changing? And this applies to both. How can they be promoting language diversity? Because definitely we do not have homogeneous groups in our classrooms. We've got learners coming from different environments. And the last one, I'm going to confess and say, I was actually asked this question in a presentation somewhere. And I hope you'll be able also to ask yourselves. Now that we have some information regarding the decolonization of the curriculum through the use of indigenous languages, where are we sending our children to? To which schools are they going to? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chuma. Thanks very much for that thought-provoking presentation, especially, the last questions that you are asking. So I'll just kick off. We have quite a lot of questions in the chat. And I'll kick off by just one of the points that you made in the slide just before this, the last one. And this is about teacher education. So right now, the Council on Higher Education, the CHE, has published for public comment, the qualification framework for teachers in initial teacher education. When I've gone through the document for both the BEd or PGCE, they do make some reference to translanguaging and all of this, but sort of as a by the way, but not as the core part of what is expected of those who prepare teachers. In other words, universities and the faculties of education. So the question really, I mean, you touched on the point, because for me, we have one education system that just happens to be handled by two departments, the Department of Basic Education and the Department of Higher Education and Training. So, and you talk about policies in your presentation. There seems to be, in my view, not just in this area, but it applies in a lot of other areas, the disconnect between what goes on in the policies in DHAT and the policies in DBE. Can you just talk about that? Because I think it's an issue. And the second question is, I think there are lessons to be learned from how Afrikaners went about this. And even today, Afrikaans children do better at school, in other words, from, foundation phase all the way up. They do better in universities that still teach in Afrikaans, even in professions, because there are professional bodies that still run examinations in English and Afrikaans. So for me, there's a case study right there, and Afrikaans is not a very old language. They still continue to develop it and borrow from others, as we know. I mean, Afrikaans comes out of a combination of Flemish, Dutch, and French, but they continue to borrow a lot of words in their lexicology or in their lexicon, as we go along. So just lessons from there, if you may. And then there are quite a number of questions in the chat, which I will go through just now. But if we just start with those questions.
Thank you. I'll start with the first question regarding the disconnect between the two departments that are actually handling the system. I think it goes back to the fact that the departments maybe are not informing each other, and it should also, in my opinion, stem from the policy, because what should be happening is that both departments should be interpreting the same policy and also interpreting it in a way that, let me say, in a complementary way, because it's one education system and it should start right from the basic up until tertiary education. But if right from the starting point, the policies that are informing the two departments do not speak to each other, then we have a problem. I'll give an example that the language and education policy, I think we've got it since 1997, and that's the one that has been saying we need to use mother tongue instruction at foundation phase level. But the introduction of multilingualism in higher education only started about 5 years ago, when the other policy has been there for quite a number of years. So the fact that these two, we've always had the Constitution saying that everybody should be taught in the language of their choice, but the two departments are not singing the same song, and that becomes a problem. So if we had the policies that are detecting that this is what should be happening in basic education, this is what should be happening in higher education, and both of them are dipping from the fact that we need to decolonize the curriculum or we need to be using mother tongue education, then the interpretation should be the same if we're all using a unified policy, and there should be some thread running across the two of them, or at least. And
you could just interrupt, I mean, just on that,
yes.
Because even though there are universities that have now started, you may find that, in fact, you do find that some of them teach indigenous languages as first additional language.
Yes.
I mean, so you teach Shivanda in English.
Yes.
And you're teaching it to people who are supposed to go and teach. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's quite some, we could just highlight a few. One other issue is we've spoken about the language education policy of 1997 saying that we need to be teaching foundation phase in indigenous languages. But then you find that our foundation phase teachers, when they are being trained in our universities, they are being trained in English. And it starts right from there. So there's quite a number of examples that we can use to actually show that there is some mismatch there. So starting from the policy, starting from, going also to how they're implementing it, it becomes a problem. And even if we say the introduction of indigenous languages has been taking place in the 5 years, not all the 26 universities are at the same level of its implementation. There are some who started 5 years ago, some are only into this project just for 12 months or a year. So it's a variety of practices, and as long as we're not still singing the same song, it will be problematic. So we need some kind of standardization, let's say within the universities first. Once we've got that, then we've got to link it to what is happening in the basic education, and right across from policy, basic and higher education. Once we start singing the same song, then we're going to be taking leaps forwards regarding this topic. There was a question regarding the Afrikaans and how it has progressed. In this case, would think that it is actually the resources that have gone into the promotion of Afrikaans as a language that make a difference. For a very long time, we've had actually schools which are using Afrikaans as their language of learning and teaching, and we have universities that are doing the same. And they have not had issues where they complain about the quality of materials that they have or having African. It was promoted and it was recognized, and where they are, those who were trying to remove those languages out of their systems, they fought very hard. So you see, there was an effort. They would go to the point where they acted and they also invested in this. And if you remember when we spoke about the example of East Coast, we said we need to bring through the different experts to come and develop this so that we can't use this as an excuse. To me, it appears like Africans got into this project much earlier, and they pulled through the experts, they developed language to a point that it could be sustainably used as a language of learning and teaching right up to higher education. The same can be done with other languages as long as we've got resources pulled in there.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat, just asking, is there consensus on where we are on this journey, especially talking about the stages that you indicated earlier? And I think you sort of answered that question. That it seems to be there's no consensus. In other words, we are at different stages in the provinces and DBE, different stages in the universities that prepare teachers. So, and again, it talks to the point that we're making about policy and the disconnect in the policy and the implementation of the policy, which is not consistent to what the policy actually. Yeah. Okay. And then the question that, have we considered the technology or considered technology to immerse students in mother tongue as a language of instruction?
I'm not sure if I'm getting the question correctly.
The question is whether we've considered technology as a possible solution in mother tongue instruction.
I would say yes, but again, there's pockets of where, I'll just give an example where we've got some researchers who have actually looked at how content that is available on the web can actually be translated into 11 of our African languages. So you read text in English, and there's an app which can actually translate instantly, and you get to understand the information. So I would say there are definitely opportunities there. There's a lot more. We should not at this point be talking about just one project into this whole debate. By now, we should be having so many other projects where we can actually get technology to assist, or because we may not be in the fourth industrial revolution, but there is a whole lot more that we can use. There are ways of bringing through technology to assist in this. Where we are right now in higher education, you'll find that there is a lot of the generative AI, where you can go and download this, or you can instruct an app to produce. And we need to start getting the information that is being fed into the artificial intelligence systems is fed by individuals. And if we're not feeding in information that is based on our indigenous languages, then they are not going to generate that. So we need to, there are opportunities there. And hopefully within the 5-6 years or so, we should actually be using this widely so that it can help us to go further in the decolonization of the curriculum.
For instance, there's a project by Professor Vukosi Marivate at the University of Pretoria, who's using artificial intelligence and large language models to train them, especially starting with the marginalized indigenous languages, like Sindebele, Tsonga, and so on. And in really, I think there's a promise there, because as you were correctly saying, Dr. Lindewood, that, if we're not ourselves as Africans, as indigenous language speakers, training these large language models or artificial intelligence on our languages, Google and OpenAI and those people that are developing generative AI models are not really going to solve that problem for us, especially if we're using our languages as academic languages or as commercial languages for that matter. The next question is, in fact, we've covered that, and it's on how the institutions of higher learning, can revise the curriculum to include more African-centered perspectives and knowledge. You've covered that in your presentation. And then pedagogy and teaching methods and how these can be incorporated in the revised curriculum to include more African-centered perspectives, sort of the same question. And then there's a point here which says, how are we dealing with the language purity, considering that we are so far in the journey? Because I think, as we know, in languages, there are purists. There are people, who do not want languages to be creolized, if I may use that term. And therefore, sometimes you can have these purists sort of get in the way. So just your thoughts on that and how we need to, deal with that situation. I mean, you talked about the lingua franca that may be used in townships and high density areas and so on. How do we deal with the issue of purists?
I'll still go back to challenging researchers, challenging institutions of higher education, so that they can actually produce these research hubs that actually focus on specific areas such as this. To me, the idea of purists, I think it all goes to standardization. And I think every language has gone through standardization. We would find that even in English, we've got words that are borrowed from French, borrowed from other languages. But at some point, we get to standardize to say, okay, there's word borrowing from it. This is now standard English. And we need to do the same with the different indigenous languages that we have. Before we get them to be standardized, then we are going to be having those who are challenging and saying, now the language is not being used in its pure form and etc. But we need to acknowledge that word borrowing has been happening since the development of language. When we can't name something like equation, we don't have it, and we then pull it from and we standardize and say, this is the word that we have pulled to use for a specific term. So we can use, there are strategies that can be used, and to get these standardizations working and effectively doing so, we need to create hubs that are going to specifically focus on this.
Okay, yeah, no, great. There's a question here about English, especially the dominance of English and the push for our children to learn the language, and sometimes exclusively for economic purposes. So the issue is, the progress or the lack thereof, which has been achieved in some of the ideas that, or even projects that you indicated earlier. And then just on that point, the issue of, has there been any research, or there's a question, any research on African homes that are speaking English, maybe as a home language, and just the impact of that? And obviously that
Yes.
would, I would imagine, apply in more upper income
Urban areas, yes.
urban areas. But just your thoughts on that.
This has actually informed the definition of mother tongue. The whole issue of mother tongue, we used to think if my mother speaks Isindebele, then Isindebele is my mother tongue. But the definition of mother tongue, I wish I could share it here. It's the language that a child would speak right from the time that they are born. So if the language that they are going to be speaking from the time they are born, and it's a language that is used consistently throughout in the home environment where they are growing, if English is that language, then it is their mother tongue. However, we find ourselves in instances where the use of the English is not specifically to the original definition of a mother tongue. The child is going to be using English 60% or 80%, but we ask him, and in that point, is it still a mother tongue? We want to conform to this idea that our children have got English as their mother tongue, but is it the notion of mother tongue in the fact that this is the primary language that if it is, then that is the child's mother tongue. But if there are instances where for at certain periods of time, the child is learning different languages, then we are steering away from that idea. So if a child has consistently been learning or consistently been exposed to English right from, or it could be French or any other language, that is the language that they speak primarily. Therefore, Isindebele or isiZulu Xhosa are going to be additional languages to that child. But in most cases, it is not the case. It will be the language that they speak, yes, for most of the time, but there will be interferences with other languages from here and there.
So the comment here from one of the participants saying, they are a foundation phase educator and concerned about the fact that when they download worksheets and so on from Google, none of those are actually in or show images of, African people.
Yes, we need to decolonize that. When we spoke about decolonizing our learning and teaching source materials, that's exactly what we're talking about. Because when I go into the classroom, I need to have my kits, my worksheets, but if they are still using photos or images that learners have got no idea what they are, that needs to be decolonized. That's where we need to be having conversations with developers of our learning and teaching source material. If I'm talking about I'm talking about money, may I not have a pound note? May I have a 10 Rand note being shown in that book so that the learner understands exactly what we're talking about? May I not have something that the learner is going to crack their head trying to understand what that is? So we need that. And the whole idea is who's producing this material that we're downloading on Google? Big question. And secondly, where are we? We are not producing and uploading the information that we can use. So we really need to challenge the development because we need the resources, and the resources need to be aligned to the discourse of decolonization. Even the textbooks, we used to in literature read about Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, but we've got African writers all over the place who can retell these stories and even explain them in the content that's using the settings that our learners understand. But if they have not been documented and they are not there as books that can be used as set books, as novels to be used in the school, then we have a problem because we're still going to be going back and using the same worksheets that are showing us pounds and etc.
Yeah. One of the things that we've done at Future Nation schools is to train teachers on how to produce their own content. In other words, these days there are tools, some of them are artificial intelligence tools, image generators. So you can actually, as long as you know how to prompt, the image generator platform, could be Canva, it could be Midjourney, there are quite a few others out there. You can prompt them to generate images that look like the students or learners that you are teaching.
Yes.
So that you're not just reliant on Google image generators or images. So that's the benefit that you can get actually from using artificial intelligence these days.
True. That's the next step, yes.
Yeah, so yes, there are quite a few of these platforms today, and some of them are actually, I know some of them you have to pay to subscribe, but some of them are actually free, so you can use some of those. I think we've covered most of the questions that are in the chat here. So, but again, there are quite a few comments that are very complimentary to the presentation. That the presentation was so informative for some of the people that are on the platform and very eye-opening. So the comments like that, especially for some people who are very old school, there are comments like that, who are still looking at things sort of the old way. Also comments about maybe examples elsewhere or platforms elsewhere, like for instance, I saw a comment here on Ambani something. There are platforms that are out there where we can learn from others that have gone down this journey in countries that are as developing as we are, that have multiple languages like we are. So, but I think, from just your own experience and the presentation of things that are in our context, it's really been absolutely amazing. And for the benefit of all our attendees here, we will post Dr. Chuma's presentation on our platforms so that it is accessible if you want to still reflect on them. And obviously, we know there are people who may not have been able to attend the session, so they will get the recording and so on. But let me take this opportunity again to thank you, Dr. Lindiwe Chuma. It was really amazing. Your presentation was eye-opening, was really illuminating, but also, show some green shoots or positive signs of things that are happening in the country. I do think, in fact, there's a comment in the chat that we need to be a lot more deliberate as a country. Just like the Afrikaners were very deliberate about how they went about the investment that went into Afrikaans, the creation of institutions that protected Afrikaans, that developed Afrikaans as an academic language, but also as a commercial language. I mean, today, government tenders still go out in English and Afrikaans, today. So we have a lot to learn from that. But let me, again, take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Chuma, and all the people who sacrificed their evening to attend this session. Let me hand over back to Piello, who's our coordinator and our host here, just to do, I know we have a video that we're going to show. There's a YouTube clip which I shared in the chat, which just shows, it's a clip that was actually done by the Mother Tongue Division on the Department of Basic Education. That just shows the experience that our children go through every day. It's a video clip that shows a class with the majority white children being taught in isiXhosa, and they're completely lost. They don't know what's going on. But that happens every day to our children.
Welcome to Future Nation Schools. Our mission is to produce young people who are confident about themselves and are passionate about what they do. We believe our students have what it takes to become our country's next
leaders,
entrepreneurs,
innovators.
We are African and we are ready for the 21st century.
Future Nation Schools aims to lead the African education revolution through our relevant, futuristic, Africa-focused and technology-enabled approach to education. Our network of schools consists of 2 campuses, one in Lyndhurst, which is less than 7 minutes away from Sandton, and the other in Vleerhof, near Roodepoort. Starting from 18 months old, Future Nation Schools offers quality, affordable, African-centered education for preschool, primary, and high school. Our program consists of an enhanced national CAPS curriculum, which includes coding, robotics, and the use of technology in the classroom, The secret to our success is our unique teaching methodology known as project-based learning that we use from preschool right through to grade 12. Students gain knowledge and skills by working on a long-term, real-world driving question to investigate and respond to their newfound knowledge authentically, engagingly, and enjoyably. Each project is framed by a meaningful problem that challenges students to find solutions. Students must engage in a rigorous, extended process of asking questions, finding information, and applying the information to inform their chosen solution. All projects are developed within a real-world context with real consequences and potential, sometimes even creating opportunities for entrepreneurial skills to be developed. Through project-based learning, students learn to think critically, solve problems, collaborate, and communicate to answer their driving question. And because this model requires students to do much more than simply remember information, studies have found that students using project-based learning understand content more deeply and retain what they learn longer. Because of this approach, we keep our classroom small. Every student is recognized as a unique individual with the ability, ambition, and desire to learn and grow beyond what she or he thought was possible. In addition to project-based learning, Africa stands at the heart of everything we do. Not only is it key for us to show our students that knowledge does not only come from the West, but we believe it's vital that young people recognize that they have a place, a really important place in the world, where they can solve problems that have global implications. But it's not only what goes on in the classroom that matters. Each of our campuses also offers a number of sporting and cultural activities that develop young people in terms of their communication, leadership, debating, and critical thinking skills that cultivates a culture of diversity, fun, respect, integrity, and passion.
Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Join us at Future Nation Schools.
We can't wait to help shape your child's future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Future Nations. Thank you to everyone who was here. Truly appreciate it. Thank you.